So today we're going to be talking about spring ephemerals. So what does that mean to people? What does ephemeral mean? I want to hear some thoughts.
And you want people to use the chat or the voice?
Something short-lived, just in the springtime?
Yeah, it could be for sure. So really, you're right. Anything that's sort of fleeting.
Comes and goes, right?
Or yeah, fleeting or short-lived.
Balance that pot out there.
We have some answers in the chat. Disappears, here today, gone tomorrow.
Comes and goes.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we're talking about spring ephemerals, in general, we're talking about the group of flowers that come up pretty quickly in the spring. Some of them come up still when there's snow on the ground. I mean, yesterday we had snow on the ground too, or 2 days ago. So in Wisconsin, it's kind of all over the board. But we do have, so they come up pretty quickly in the
Nice and brown.
and also before, typically before leaf out of the trees. So they're really trying to capture that sunlight pretty quickly and get their blooms open, available for pollinators, and then go to seed before the leaves are really fully out on the trees. Well, most of them, their leaf material sort of dies back in the ground and you can't even see it. It's alive under the ground waiting for next year, but the leaf material completely goes away. There are others that their vegetation is persistent, so their vegetation doesn't necessarily disappear, but the flower portion sort of comes up, blooms, and then dies back. Plants all evolve to sort of fill these niches, right? There are all sorts of niches. So in the spring in Wisconsin, the soil begins to thaw from the top down. So spring ephemerals typically are a little more shallow rooted, kind of rhizomatous or bulbs that are existing in those top layers of soil. And as that soil begins to thaw, then they can begin to draw up moisture and put forth their growth. It sort of gives them that advantage of those later season ones that are typically more deeply rooted, have to kind of wait for the ground to thaw down to that deeper layer of soil. It's also, there are a whole series of insects and pollinators and critters that come out in the spring, and these are their primary source of food initially. So they need these really early spring blooms to be able to collect pollen. For instance, the queen bumblebee, right? Singular queen will come out, emerge. She has to collect all of this food and nectar immediately to have her food source and gain energy before she can find her nesting site for the season, for the year. She'll go find her nesting site. And then she lays her eggs, sits on her larva. She also does this really interesting thing where she goes in, finds her new nesting site with wax that she exudes from her body, makes this sort of little bowl near them and fills it with nectar so that she has something for energy while she's sitting on the larva, and does this little sort of buzz warming thing to keep her larva warm while they're developing, and then goes out and they are the worker bees that then collect pollen for the rest of the year. So the queen bumblebee, among many others that need sort of that quick bit of energy early in the spring, these are what they really need and require. They also, oh wait, slide's not going to advance. They also need, oh, there we go. So these are some of the critters. So they also, it's a co-adaptive relationship, right? The pollinators are really helping ensure that there's genetic diversity within each species. They're cross-pollinating from flower to flower. They're ensuring that it doesn't just become one clonal species. There are some flowers that self-pollinate as well, and those, genetic diversity is less within a self-pollinator because, right, it's only really, a self-pollination really creates about a clone of the parent. The cross-pollination is bringing wider genetic diversity, which is what adds stability to any species, is having more genetic diversity. It gives you resilience to if there's a disease or conditions change, there's more plasticity in the ability to adapt. So the flowers provide the food for the insects. The insects are helping the flowers with that genetic diversity and cross-pollination. There are all sorts of critters. So there are flies, there are hoverbees, minor bees, aphids, beetles, fritillaries. We'll talk a little bit later about fritillaries, but they absolutely have to have violets. Fritillaries depend on violets as their host plant. And there are so many critters that have very particular host plants that absolutely need. And I'm sure many of you are aware, there's a lot of biodiversity collapse that's been happening over the last 40 years that we should all be concerned about, and we should all be looking for ways that we can help to combat that. Invertebrates alone have declined by 45%. So that's pretty significant in the last 40 years, as well as mammals, vertebrates in general. So mammals, fish, reptiles, birds have all declined about 50% since 1970. Many of you are birders, so you're aware that we've lost about 1/3 of the bird populations over the last 50 years as well. So these are things that, especially helping the pollinators, that's helping the plants, that's helping our food crops. They also add about 200, somewhere in the range of $250 to $500 billion per year in pollination services to our crops each and every year. So we should all be concerned for our own well-being, as well as 96% of terrestrial birds feed larvae to their young. So they also need all of these critters to keep producing and laying those eggs and forming that larva. Just one brood of chickadees takes between 6,000 and 10,000 larvae to raise one nest. So think of all of the nests of chickadees. They need 6,000 to 10,000. So we need pollinators for many, many different reasons, and insects for many, many different reasons. And we should all help provide the food service that they need. This is one that I want to talk about that a lot of people say, oh yeah, Kim, you're a plant person. What is this? And they're so proud of all these little plants that are popping up. So in the spring, people love to plant crocuses and tulips and daffodils. And they're fine, but they're not actually providing much ecological integrity to our system, right? They're not host plants to our native species. They're not providing much. This is one that people love and they love to send a picture of. And what is this? So this is Siberian Squill. You can still purchase this from loads of different nurseries and plant it in your yard. But on the right, this is what it does in the woodland. So sure, it's cute. It's ecologically destructive, providing very few ecosystem services and taking over and forcing out the plants that we do need that are specific host plants for our native insects. So what I would encourage people to do is not to plant things like Siberian Squill and other non-native bulbs in their yard. There are loads of native plants that are beautiful and would be much better choices than choosing to. We have showy plants of our own that I'll show you, and hope that we could get rid of some of the non-native ones. I know we've said this many times, and I love to say it, Michaela said it. Putting non-natives in your yard is kind of like putting out a bowl of plastic fruit. It's beautiful, but not very useful. Okay, so if Ethan, I can't see the chat, but if people, I would love for people to take a wild guess what you think these spring ephemerals on the left, what they have in common with Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. They have something very specific in common between those. Does anyone have a guess what it might be?
Go ahead and use that chat function to submit your guess.
If nobody has a guess, that's okay, but you should take a wild guess.
Tim said hallucinations. Someone else said not a clue. Hardy.
Hallucinations is a good guess. Mayaples and some others do create hallucinations. But no, what they do have in common, so bloodroot, trout lily, spring beauty, and violets, what do they have common with Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull? Ants. So if anyone remembers that movie, it's an older movie, so I'm not sure how many people have seen it. But Indiana Jones is he's sort of battling with the Russian spies to try and find the crystal skull before they do. It has some amazing powers or something. So they're looking for that. But in the meantime, they have this battle scene on the cliffside of and what happens is they get to of course, Indiana Jones escapes with his whip and his hat. But there's these massive armies of ants that take down several of the Russian spies at the same time. It's pretty dramatic. So ants are a powerful thing. E.O. Wilson spent the majority of his life studying ants. They're pretty amazing critters. But what they have to do with plants is some of our native woodland wildflowers, ants collect this, they take the seed once they've gone to seed, because some of our species have these eliosomes, which are this lipid fatty material on the seed. And the ants will take them away and they feed them to their larvae and their young, and then they sort of discard the seed. So they bring them into their little homes, and they feed them to their larvae, and then they kind of toss out the seeds. And the seeds then are kind of in this organic composty kind of trash pile that the ants have. So it's fertile soil, and then the seeds germinate. So they can help distribute the plants around a woodland system or a yard. They're very important. So also don't kill those ant piles in your yard. They're very useful, and they also have their ecological integrity. All right, so now we'll talk about some of these cute little plants. So this is one, I think Tim mentioned it in one of his recent as well. This one is called pasque-flower, and it's just a very cute little flower. It's one of the first ones to come up in the spring, usually through the snow. It's very fuzzy. Anemone Patents is the name. And also, sometimes botanists like to rename things when they've regained some, or they've figured out some more genetic links between different species or variations between species. So there also is a name for it, Pulsatilla patens as well. Anemone patens is the one that I learned when I was in school. So it has all these multi-stamens. You can see all those stamens sort of globbed in right around the pistil. So the pistil in the middle where it will produce its seed, and then those many stamens around it that are going to. And they have, so some of it blooms between March and May. It's very early. Bees collect the pollen, syrphid flies, there are aphids, bombus, so the large bees, and all sorts of other critters that utilize it. So it's an important, really quick, really early in the spring, just when things begin to emerge. The queen butterflies can begin flying around at about 41 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you think they're emerging, they really need something to feed on quickly. So this is one of those early ones. This is another one that blooms a little bit later in the season, but this has just an interesting system. So Jack in the Pulpit, Erycema triphyllum is, I like when the names are very explanatory to the plant. The large leaves are in 3 leaflets, the Jack in the Pulpit. They have this spadix and the spade. So that flower is very interesting. It's much like the peace lilies that you see. They're sort of in that same family, the arum family. Also, in Japan, there are many, many species that are indigenous to of different types of Jack in the Pulpits. And they did a study where they could determine that when a gnat flew in, they would get trapped in there and be able to pollinate it. But it was more complicated than that. So the male flowers, our native species has the male flowers on the top of the spadix and then the females below. But in some different species, they have a male flower and a female flower. So what they found was in the male flowers, the gnats would go in and they could fly back out, right? They want them to take the pollen and go to someplace else. And the female flowers, when they went in, they would get stuck. So that was sort of its adaptation for pollination. that co-evolution of the gnats and the jack in the pulpits. This is also a beautiful one. Spring Beauty is one of our very early ones that come up. Claytonia Virginica. It's in the Portulaca family. It's very fine and very small, but one of the really interesting things about this, they're 5-petaled. They have those sort of pink lines that come in, and they always say those are kind of the bring the pollinator in. It's kind of their, like at the airplane, at the air runway, they're trying to bring them in to pollinate on those plants. Spring Beauty also has an array of species: mason bees, cuckoo bees, carpenter bees, bumblebees, skippers. Also, the roots of them are edible to eastern chipmunk. So when we see those chipmunks out really early in the spring, right, they need things to eat as well. So they're sort of digging up and eating some of these plants. These are also really interesting because the anthers on the stamen that you can see, they're pink at the tip, and that's really unusual. Cutleaf toothwort. This is also a beautiful plant. It have very deeply serrated leaves, so they're sort of in these groups of 3 as they branch out from underneath, and then it comes up and it has kind of this loose raceme of flowers. And they have the basal leaves, you can see how they're whorled as they come around. They have also, another interesting thing is they've adapted so that you can see on the right, the picture where the pistil comes out of the middle, right? That's the female part that'll have the ovary in the base of it. The stamens, there's sort of 4 right up along the pistil and then 2 further back. So it has 6 stamens total. And some of that is an adaptation for different pollinators to visit it. So some of the stronger pollinators that might go in a little bit deeper and grab that pollen will mix, and some of the smaller pollinators might come and just collect the pollen from the tip. So then they fly on to the next one. So this is in the mustard family, right? This is the brassica family. It's one of our natives. One of the things that's really pushing it out is garlic mustard, which is also in the mustard family, obviously, the brassica. They always have mustard family always have 4 petals. They're very distinct. It's sort of like a cross. It also used to be called cruciferous family. So they are host caterpillars to the whites. So the Lepidoptera group of whites butterflies are host plants on mustards. One of the issues is now many of them are mistaking garlic mustard for the native mustard, and they may lay their eggs on them, but then the whites larvae that come out can't metabolize that plant material. So right, we have the insects and the plants that co-evolve for thousands of years. They produce enzymes to be able to metabolize certain materials. So when they lay on the garlic mustard plant, then they can't metabolize and eat that, so the larva won't survive. So that's an issue. This is a beautiful one that many people know. This is bloodroot. These pictures are, well, the ones on the left are, I think the bottom one is Riverside Park and the top one is Washington Park. Today we're performing a prescribed burn in Washington Park, but I encourage people who haven't walked through to go through and look at that woodland area that Michaela's been restoring. There are some pretty amazing spring woodland wildflowers in there. This is a great one that I always like to show people and kids, not to damage a lot of it, but if you break the leaf of the bloodroot, you'll see it has this kind of orangish red sap in it, which also makes it distasteful to many animals. It's the acridness of that sap. So they have, they're typically have 8 to 16 white petals, and they have this system where each one comes up. So there's 1 leaf and 1 flower. And when it's cold, the flower will close up and the leaf kind of curls around it sort of to protect it from the frost. After that, you can see kind of on the upper right where the flowers have gone to seed. They just have this little tiny seed head above. And so these are one, remember that the ants will help distribute. So they have that elaeosome that's attached to it that is very the ants are very interested in to feed their larvae. So they help distribute the bloodroot around, which is really great. They also have a really interesting thing that they have the stamens, as you can see on the right, those stamens sort of bend out. Each flower opens and it's only open for about 3 days, but the stamens will sort of first open way out because their ideal is to be cross-pollinated so they can help with that genetic diversity. So they open way out in hopes that a bumblebee or another fly or another will come and gather the pollen and then go to the next flower and kind of spread it out. If it doesn't end up pollinated after a day or two, the stamens will actually fold back in around the ovary and it'll self-pollinate. So its ideal is open wide, be cross-pollinated by insects. If that doesn't happen, maybe there's a cold snap and the insects aren't out, they'll close back in. So at least it makes sure it still produces seed, right? Evolutionarily, things always want to try and get to the next generation. So it needs to produce that seed. So it sort of has like the backup plan if things don't go well. Oh yeah, and bloodroot, the name Sanguinaria canadensis, you can all imagine the sanguinaria is blood, and the color of that sap is the indicator for that. And that's in the poppy family. This is sharp-lobed Hepatica and round-lobed Hepatica. They're very, very similar, except the shape of the leaf. And so on the bottom, you see the round-lobed Hepatica, the Anemone americana, and then on the top, Anemone actiloba, which means sort of sharp lobe, sharp point. When I learned it, it was Hepatica actiloba, Hepatica americana. But like I said, sometimes they like to change the names. So they come up and they have several 5 to 11 sepals. So these aren't actually petals, these are actually sepals and then bracts at the base. You can see they have the very center of them, they have quite a few carpels, so they'll produce multiple seeds per flower. And then around the edge, they have these white stamens. So those white stamens are also pretty distinct. And at least in my mind, if you aren't looking at the basal leaves, these look quite a bit like the other anemones, Rue Anemone we'll talk about. One of the differences is Hepatica has these white stamens, and we'll see later how Rue has sort of yellow stamens. But if you look below, they also have these really sweet little fuzzy kind of stems that they come up on. The pedicel that the flower is on is fuzzy. And some of that is also a little bit of insulation protection from the cold because they also emerge so early. Wild hyacinth. So I talked about, there are lots of things you can plant that are native in place of some of our typical bulbs that you see sold in nurseries. So we do have a wild hyacinth. And these two pictures here are both from Washington Park as well, around the ephemeral pond and then in the woodland. So this is a really beautiful and distinct plant. It's Camisa scilloides. And it's in the lily family. So much like the lily family often has things in groups of 3. So these are tepals, which are petal and sepal that look the same. So they have 6 tepals, which really are 3 petals, 3 sepals, but they look the same. And these pretty distinct anthers that stick out with the yellow tips on them. Their leaves are not very showy down in the base of them. And they start to bloom sort of from the bottom up, which gives them, a different sort of flower blooms every couple days so that they also are giving a broader opportunity for pollinator visits. This is one that blooms a little bit later in the spring. The shooting star, the Dodecathion media, is in the primrose family. And this is technically a 5-petaled flower. The picture up on the right, that's from Chewockie Prairie. If you would it's an amazing sight if you go sort of mid to late May to Chewockie Prairie. There are just fields of shooting stars, and they range from sort of white to pink to this bright fuchsia color. The one in the middle is Riverside Park. The one on the left is either I had a Washington Park one in here, but I think up near the building there are some shooting stars blooming. One of the other really cool things about this is the anthers, as they go down around the pistil, or the stigma and the style, the anthers that are kind of holding very tight around there. One of the pollinators that pollinates this is the bumblebee. And the queen bumblebee, who's strong enough to hold on to it and then do this sort of buzz vibration with her body to release the pollen out of those anthers, which is pretty cool. I've seen there are some videos online that are really, really interesting to watch. So these have very low basal leaves, and then they send up the shoot with the bloom on it, and this thing kind of dies back. The leaves might remain for a fair amount. There are a bunch of these in the Washington Park woodland, as well as the bioswales in the Riverside Park parking lot. So many of these, I'm talking about Washington Park and Riverside Park because there's more woodland there. At Menominee Valley, it's majority prairie, so we don't have as many woodland wildflowers within that stretch of space. Okay. This is, many of you probably recognize, Virginia bluebells. So Virginia bluebells, they have 5 petals. They're very tubular. So you can see how they're sort of fused at the base of them. They do a great job of spreading, but they're early spring. So they come up, they bloom, and then they die back, and your next set of flowers can come up. So your midsummer, your fall flowers. When they first come up and it's really cold out, they kind of have this purple look of that lower left. That's from my yard. It's pretty dramatic. Then as they sort of dangle down like this, they're visited by all sorts of pollinators. The last few years, I've had ruby-throated hummingbirds gathering the nectar from the Virginia bluebells. They're they have a really dramatic show and kind of have this nice glow in the spring. You can see how the sunlight is still coming through the woodland, like we talked about. So the one on the left in Riverside Park, before the trees have fully leafed out, they're gathering that sunlight and photosynthesizing as quickly as they can to produce flower, set seed, and then die back into the ground. They're visited by all sorts of, the giant bee. They have both nectar and pollen, butterflies, skippers, sphinx moths, amorpha bees, mason bees, honeybees. So they're a really important early season resource. This one is Jacob's Ladder. This is from my front yard. They're almost iridescent, aren't they? They're almost like fluorescent, how bright they come out with this kind of whitish, pale, bluish, purple color. They're really pretty dramatic, but not very large. They would stand maybe 12 inches tall. They have these pinnately divided leaves with leaflets coming off of each side, which I believe is how they came with the ladder reference, is sort of that shape of the leaf that you can see in those pictures. And this is in the phlox family. Phlox have 5 petals. We'll talk a little bit about that later. Some of the phlox that there's some look-alike sort of. So Pelhamonium Reptons is the scientific name. They kind of are curved like this, and they will open up more. They bloom kind of early to mid-spring. They have both nectar and pollen. They're visited primarily by bees and honeybees, cuckoo bees, miner bees, giant fly bee, and the larvae of a couple different moths also feed on the leaves, the vegetation. So they're a host plant to several, as well as aphids. They're kind of one of my favorite in my front yard as they bloom. You can see that really distinct stamen. So they like parts of 5. The stamens going around, and then the top of the stigma. So the female part, the stigma style ovary, if you can see in that middle picture, you can see how they're parted so that they'll produce multiple carpels per flower as well, multiple seeds. This is a wonderful one that is really prolific in the walls of the ravine in Riverside Park. So that's one that was still persisting sort of through the onslaught of garlic mustard. When I began in Riverside Park 21 years ago, pretty much the entire ravine was covered in garlic mustard. Now it's few and far between, which is wonderful. It's very successful. This is one that still had survived. They grow fairly densely. Their basal leaves are really dramatic and interesting. They're sort of this waxy brown and green mottled, which is where, so white trout lily on the left, the Erythronium albidum is their lily family, and then the yellow trout lily, the Erythronium americanum. The one on the right is from Shorewood Nature Preserve. They have the yellow ones blooming in there. You can see how they have these very reflex sort of petals that bend back. They sort of have that flying nun look. So they open, they're sort of protecting from above their anthers and their stamen. They have 6 parts. So like the lily family, it's all really in pairs of 3, but these again are tepals. So there's 3 petals, 3 sepals, and they look the same. So it looks like three tepals, we call it. Those basal leaves are persistent through much of the year, but the flower comes up, sets fruit, dies back. They also have an interesting story. They're mid-spring, they're visited by long and short-tongued bees. So when you talk about the long-tongued bees, those are the ones that can gather the nectar way in the back of the flower. And typically the short-tongued bees are really only getting the pollen right around the anthers. So that some plants produce nectar and pollen, and some only produce pollen. These produce both. They also have, there's something about, they hold tightly to the petals are helping to sort of protect that pollen as well. And before they're open, when it's very cold, they're sort of drooping down around it. And especially if it's raining, if you go into the woods, you'll see them kind of protecting and drooping down around it. Okay, this is the Rue Anemone that I talked about earlier. And as I was pulling the pictures together, and I was sure I had all Rue Anemone pictures, many of the pictures from here are pictures that I've taken in our parks or my yard. The one in the middle is one from the internet. You can see the picture credit, but you can see how they have multiple petals. So they have 5 to 8 petals. They're petal-like sepals, so they're technically sepals. And they also kind of have this where the petals are when the stamens are ready, they open up back a little bit to attract the pollinators. You can see how many pistils are in the middle there. So those lighter green spots, those are the female pistils. The one on the upper left, as I was gathering, and I thought I had Rue Anemone pictures, and then I looked at it a little bit closer, and that's actually a Hepatica. The Rue Anemones typically have, the leaves are different. So the Hepatica has those 3 lobed leaves, like I talked about. The Rue Anemone has, usually has 3 leaves with 3 leaflets each, very similar to Columbine. The lower right one, there actually is Columbine on the left, but the right side are the leaves of the Rue Anemone. And they vary from pink to white. Their stamens, the anthers tend to be yellow. The one over on the left, where you can't see the leaves because the leaves are lower below it, are, you can see how the anthers are white. Michaela had sent me this one from Washington Park, and it was being visited by, I think it might be a minor bee. So it was being visited by an insect, so she sent it to me, and I plopped it in this one and then realized that I had mixed them. The anemones are, the flower, if you just see the flower and you can't see the leaves very well, they're very similar. They're in the same family, right? And the anemone is also ant dispersed. So this is another one that has the elaeosome on the seed, that little lipid fatty structure that the ants like. So they help distribute it. So the large flowering trillium. This is a more showy flower. Lots of people like this one because it's very big and showy. The picture on the left is in Riverside Park near one of the ravines to the river. You can see how they kind of start to turn this pinkish color as they age. So once the flower begins to age, it kind of has a pink hue to it. And this is Trillium grandiflorum, also the lily family. So this one you can see where it has 3, right? Lilies most things are in sets of 3s. So it has the leaflets right below it are in 3, the petals are in 3, and then this one actually has true sepals and petals. 3 sepals with the 3 petals with the sepals sort of alternating behind it. Interestingly, this one is much more showy, but it's not visited as often by insects. It does have some. There are carpenter bees, and a couple others that suck the nectar and collect the pollen, another small bee, but there aren't as many as in some of the other ones we talked about. The caterpillars of a couple moths use the vegetation as their host plant. And this is also distributed by ants. So interestingly, some species give off a sweet smell that will attract honeybees and bumblebees, more of the bee species. And then other species like the jack in the pulpit, skunk cabbage, the prairie trillium, some of the trilliums give off more of a musky kind of rotting smell, and they're trying to attract the flies. So they're trying to, depending upon which pollinator they're trying to attract, it depends upon which scent they're exuding. This is also a favorite of mine. This one's called Dutchman's Breeches. You might recognize Dicentra colcularia is related to bleeding hearts that when I was a kid, my mom always said bleeding hearts in our yard. So these are related, but this is the native one. So then you have the native host species will be able to utilize this. So much better to have the native one. So this Dutchman's Breeches, the Dicentra part of the name is Greek for di, twice, centron, spurred. So it's this 2-spurred. So you can see why that name is very accurate. It also is called Dutchman's Breeches because it kind of looks like pantaloons hanging along a line. There are 2 white petals with those nectar spurs in the back and then sort of 2 yellows coming out. Those bumblebees are one of the ones that are strong enough to kind of shake the pollen out of it. These seeds, and they're visited by multiple other bees as well, long-tongued bees, short-tongued bees, adrenid bees, giant fly bee, butterflies, skippers, and all sorts of other things. So early, so they're strong enough to get the pollen out, and these long-tongued bees can gather that nectar way back in those spurs on the backside of it. It's just a really interesting one that the leaves, the vegetation will also stay a little bit longer through the year. And this is the poppy family, interestingly, because the way the petals have fused you would not think of that as looking at it. Right one is in Washington Park. Left one is from the internet. This is a great one that has a very long bloom time. So when a lot of your others have sort of come up, bloom, drop back, and you're still waiting for those later summer flowers, this is a really great one that then comes up and has a fairly long bloom time, and the vegetative portions of it will stay. So wild geranium, Geranium Immaculatum. The right one is a picture from my front yard. The left one, I believe, is from Washington Park. Lower one is probably from Riverside Park. So this has 5 pretty distinct petals, and they're kind of this pinkish, bluish purple range. They sell lots and lots of cultivated varieties similar to this. I would encourage people to plant the native one. So all of the critters that use this as a host plant for their larvae, they can metabolize the plant material of the native species and have a much harder time of the cultivated non-native species. So I always strongly encourage, similar with Monarda and some other ones that you see lots and lots of different varieties of it. If you plant the native one, then you're really giving them sort of the food source that they need. This also produces nectar and pollen. You can see how much pollen the gathered all over that bee that's on it right now. Yeah. So they have all sorts of insects that feed on the leaves as well. And moth species, ebony bugs, eastern chipmunk eat the seeds of it. So it's a pretty, the leaves last for a long time, so it's able to be used by quite a few different as species for host plant. This is, watching my time. This is Marsh Marigold. This works mostly if you have a very damp, moist spot in your yard. We have it growing in Riverside Park in the pond in the front, as well as along the bike path. There are sort of those swales that gather water. They're growing within there. They're nice. They come up very early in the season. You can see how those, it's sort of this thick, waxy plant with this heart-shaped leaf, Caltha palustris. And the distinct flowers with those 5 petals that are kind of waxy as well, and those really strong, thick-looking stamens. So these are, they're pollinated, they both nectar and pollen are visited by giant bee flies, syrphid bees, halicta bees, honeybees, a couple leaf beetles. And the seeds of this plant are also utilized by multiple small mammals. So we have voles, eastern chipmunk, wood duck, so it will also eat these leaves. It's a really great one to see in the spring if you're in a nice moist area. And if you have a really damp rain garden, it's a great plant for that as well. So this one, people don't often think is one of our spring ephemerals, but it really is. And the leaves are a little more persistent throughout the season. The one on the left is in my yard, one on the right might be Riverside. So wild strawberry, Fragaria virginiana, is a really important plant. It's in the rose family. Rose family is always pretty distinct with the 5 petals and then the 5 sepals sort of arranged in between them. So you always see kind of these points of sepals coming out. And then multiple stamen around the edge. One of the reasons I wanted to put this on here, so these are pretty adaptable to different conditions. They're also great if you're trying to sort of naturalize your yard and remove grass. One of the reasons I wanted to put the wild strawberry on here is because we're talking about a lot of host species and pollinators. This is the list of what the ecological value are to insects, birds, animals, mason bees, halicta bees, cuckoo bees, syrphid flies, thick-headed butterflies, butterfly skippers. So the native wild strawberry has so many associates with it between the pollen and the vegetative part and the seed, the fruit. That they had to put links to the tables because there were so many things that it served as useful for as in wildlife. So I would encourage anyone, if you're trying the edges of your yard or edges of your flower borders, this is a great one to incorporate.
Kim, I'm not leaving till you read that whole list. But secondly, we had two questions. One is, when is a good time to plant wild strawberry in the spring, ? And then there was another question that you talk about either now or later is where to purchase these plants that you're
great
talking
point.
about.
Don't let me forget about the where to purchase part.
Okay.
You have an opportunity for you. Oh wait, I lost what. So most of our native plants, you can really plant anytime you can get a shovel in the ground. Some of the spring ephemerals, it's hard to see them. Many growers won't sell them if it's not showing any of the green material. Okay, I'll mention already. On May 22nd, we're having a native plant sale at Riverside Park in the warehouse, similar to what we did last year. You do have to register before because we're still maintaining social distancing. There will be some spaces for walk-ups. So Randy Powers from Prairie Future Seed Company will be selling. So he will have some spring ephemerals. He won't sell them once they go dormant, even though they're still in the pot. because he feels like people might not trust that they're actually in there if you can't see something. But you can plant native plants anytime you can get a shovel in the ground, really. So the challenge for midsummer is just you have to make sure to water them much more so that they don't desiccate and dry out. And if you're trying to plant after mid-November, sometimes they freeze, thaw, pop out of the ground, and then they desiccate and dry out. So, but really, if you can get a shovel in the ground, you can put them in the ground. They're adapted to our weather and our crazy Wisconsin systems. So May 22nd, I'll probably mention that again. It's either up on our website now or it will be soon. You can pre-order and just pull up and pick up your plants, or you can come up and shop. And so that's a great way to get any of these type of species. And this, we'll have one later in the season as well, but we wanted to make sure we captured some of these spring ephemerals by having our early season one. Okay, so you see how wild strawberry, everyone on earth should plant it, or at least in Wisconsin. This is Prairie Smoke, and this is one I really love. Here on the right, it's in front of the Riverside Park building. On the left, I think it's in one of the bioswales. On the left lower is in my yard. You can see how interesting it is that it's blooming. On the lower left is the blooming picture. So the flowers are not very showy. It has these bracts that come out, the sepals. So those are the red parts. And then it has kind of these reddish pinkish petals inside, and they're pretty tightly held together. So there are, bumblebees are the strongest to be able to seek the nectar within those. I think the most fun part of the Prairie Smoke, though, so they have these pinnately divided leaves. The leaves do kind of stay persistent through most of the season, so you still have that vegetative kind of ground cover look in your yard. If you have a space you want ground cover. But once they're pollinated and they go to seed, that's this old man whiskers look, the Prairie Smoke look, and that's the most dramatic. So at the base of each of those is one seed. You can see they're multi-pistiled, so they have lots of seeds within each plant. And they're pretty dramatic. I love the look of them. And they're easy to grow, and they can grow in some pretty crummy soils as well. So we have those in front of, I didn't talk about silverweed, but that's another great one within this rose family. Wild Columbine. This is one that blooms a little bit later in the spring. But it has these wonderful nectar spurs that come out of the back. So it has, the petals are yellow with then the red nectar spur coming out of the back. Lots and lots of anthers. You can see all of those down there. And the pistils, look at all of those long pistils coming out, are the sort of more hairy ones that are extended. So in the very back of that is this sweet nectar. These will also be visited by hummingbird moths and hummingbirds. And if you ask Jeff Vaglon, he'll just go on and pop one in his mouth. They're sweet, so you can eat the flower. It's actually has a pretty sweet flavor with that nectar that's stored in back of there. And then there are all sorts of other larvae and insects that feed on it. So it's an important food source. Okay, I'm speeding up now. Sorry, I'm going over. Okay, this is one that just has several on it. Mayaples are really great. So is large flowering bellwort and wild leeks. Leeks are interesting. They come up. If you gather them, you have to pretty much kill them, or you can cut them off. There is no gathering of vegetation in Milwaukee County parks, just so you know that there is an ordinance against it. You can gather in many of the state parks, though. You should look at restrictions before you go. So the leeks come up, they're also in the lily family, and then the leaves die back and then they bloom. So they bloom afterwards. So they're just a really interesting 6 pistils, 6 stamens. Okay, I'm going to next. This, I just wanted to remind everyone, there are also shrubs that you can plant that bloom in the spring and are very important for our pollinators. These are both from my yard, black chokeberry and black cherry. Woodland phlox, this is also from my yard. Woodland phlox I want to mention, always have 5 petals. Dame's rocket has 4 petals and is mustard family and is often confused with phlox. If you see it with 4 petals, it's an evil thing and you should remove it. Unless it's toothwort or crest, don't remove those. So this is golden ragwort, phlox, and violet in my yard. That lower left picture is kind of next to my backyard, next to my shed. And irises, because they're beautiful. This one's next to the lagoon at Washington Park. and violets. Michaela mentioned violets when she was talking about herbaceous species, and I just wanted to reiterate that violets are a really amazing plant that you should encourage and embrace in your yard. They have these lines on the lowest petal that are kind of like the runway, like we saw in Spring Beauty, for the pollinators to come in. They have these fuzzy sides and they have this little nectar spur out of the back. There we have over 20 native violets, even the common blue violet that you see in your yard all the time. There are other great ones, the yellow downy violet, bird's foot violet. So there are lots and lots to choose from. You should embrace and encourage them to be in your yard, at least in my opinion. These are some of the animals that use violets, especially the fritillary butterflies. They require violets as their host plant. So if we remove all the violets, we'll have no fritillary butterflies. And I showed you that picture at the very beginning, those beautiful orange and brown butterflies. So we should encourage those. So all sorts of critters use them, including turkeys, ruffed grouse, mourning doves, all sorts of different birds as well. One of the reasons is, I think Michaela talked a little bit about this, the Clystogamus flowers. So when you have the chasmogamous flowers that are open, big, the regular showy flowers that we see that are on top of the violet, that's what we think of the violet flowers. Violets also, underneath their leaves, next to the soil, they produce all these Clystogamus flowers, and they're closed up and they self-pollinate. So violets have this adaptive thing. The flowers that are above attract pollinators, and that will help them with genetic diversity and cross-pollinating. And the flowers that are below that they self-pollinate are sort of their just-in-case flowers, right? So they know that they're going to produce these, they're going to pollinate, they're under the ground. This pulled up picture is not the flowers, it's sort of the after flowers. The guy, if anyone wants to look up awkwardbotany.com, the guy has some pretty hilarious blogs on there. But he had dug up a violet to sort of show you what it looks like. And this is showing you what it's after it's fruited. So this Clystogamus flower has self-pollinate, and these are the fruit it produces. So those are all of these seeds that the ants, remember these have the elaiosomes, the lower right, that the ants are interested in to feed to their young. The Clystogamus and the chasmogamous flowers both have seeds with elaiosomes. So they're feeding the ants, they're feeding all sorts of critters. The fritillaries need them. They like to sort of come out and go across our lawns, and we should embrace that, is what I want to encourage. And what does it come back to? Who's distributing all of these things? We come back to the ant, because then E.O. Wilson would be really proud of us.